Welcome to You Decide. I'm your host, Errol Louis, and today we're going to talk about hunger from two different levels, two different angles. At the federal level, there's this sweeping new law that Donald Trump just signed. It was run through the Republican-dominated Congress, and it's going to eliminate billions of dollars from SNAP and other safety net programs. We're going to find out more about that. Here in the city, though, we're still in the middle of this race for mayor, and the Democratic nominee for mayor, Zohran Mamdani, has a proposal to create city-owned grocery stores in each borough, in each of the 5 boroughs that make up New York City. It's a tale of two Americas. We're going to look at what's happening at the federal level and at the local level with the person who is ideal for this, and that is Joel Berg, the CEO of Hunger Free America. Thanks for coming in. Great to see you.
My pleasure.
So let's talk about this big bill that Congress just passed. It was intended to make tax cuts from the first Trump term permanent. That, of course, requires trillions of dollars. It takes trillions of dollars out of the budget. Congress chose to make it up by cutting into social assistance programs, including SNAP. How is the law going to do that?
It's just god-awful. I mean, the first thing to keep in mind is they didn't have their policy proposals that they thought were good public policy for food and healthcare. They had a number of how much they needed to cut to pay for their tax cuts for the rich. And then they added on a number of another $60 billion to cut from food assistance to pay for essentially corporate welfare for large farm operations. I don't even say farmers, people who own farmland. So that was another $60 billion. So the final bill is cutting $290 billion just from SNAP, roughly $700 billion from Medicaid, so nearly $1 trillion. You know, and it's hard to grasp what $1 trillion is, but it's a billion is 1,000 millions, and a trillion is 1,000 billions.
Right.
And so it's just mind-bogglingly large. And a lot of the media coverage focused on the so-called far-right, fiscal conservatives who pledged to vote against the bill and didn't. But frankly, the so-called moderates, who I don't think are actually moderates, got off scot-free. You know, in the Senate, there were 3 Republicans votes against the bill, one of whom announced he's retiring, concorded with announcing he's voting against the bill. And one of the 3 said the cuts weren't big enough, Rand Paul. And then in the House, there were 2 votes against it by Republicans, and one of them said the cuts weren't big enough. So literally out of both houses of Congress, only 1 Republican voted no. And as you know, Hunger Free America is studiously a nonpartisan group. As you know, I've taken Democrats to task when they're not good enough on our issues. But the fact of the matter is, every single Democrat in the House of Representatives, every single Republican in the United States, every single Democrat in the House of Representatives, and every single Democrat in the U.S. Senate voted no. And virtually every Republican voted yes. So it was fashionable for many years, when it was no longer true, to say this is a bipartisan issue. But it really isn't anymore. And they've done a bait and switch. A little of the money is coming from work requirements. But that's not where the money's coming from. And they're saying, oh, we're cutting off benefits to undocumented immigrants. Undocumented immigrants weren't eligible for SNAP before this. It's coming out of seniors, working people, people with disabilities, veterans, and children. And that's the reality. And we need to hold those who voted for this accountable. And I don't think it's a shock. I know you occasionally dabble in discussing politics, that most of the cuts won't be implemented until after the midterm elections. If the majority was just so proud of these accomplishments, you'd think they'd do it sooner.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting thing. The staging of all of this really sort of matters, so that the tax cut side of it is going to take effect in time for people when they file their 2025 taxes in April of 2026. But the cuts won't take effect until after the midterm in November of 2026. So that is it possible then that people won't necessarily feel the pain of budget cuts until the end of next year?
That is possible, or for some even later. You know, I have a grudging respect for people I disagree with ideologically who stick to their guns. So Rand Paul, I probably couldn't agree on the day this is being taped, but he voted against it.
Right.
And if you really want to understand the hypocrisy of what they've done, the whole idea of basing how much states would have to pay out of their pocket for SNAP, what used to be called food stamps, was based on the idea that, well, the states really had to have skin in the game. And there's a whole nother issue that the error rates aren't fraud rates. They're marginal administrative error rates, sometimes too much in benefits, sometimes too little. And sometimes people eligible for $2.20 a meal and, God forbid, get $2.30 a meal. So it's a crazy metrics anyway. But the whole idea of the original version of the bill, if it's the states had the highest error rates, you'd make them pay more out of their pocket.
Sure.
And the Republicans and the conservatives, I was on a national radio show with the American Enterprise Institute, which is run by my old sparring partner, Robert Doar. And someone representing him said, well, you want skin in the game to give incentives for the states to do better. And so what did they do? Alaska, and they desperately wanted the vote of Senator Murkowski. Alaska had by far the highest error rate in the country. And so they passed originally language that said this doesn't apply to non-contiguous states with the lower 48. The Senate parliamentarians said, you can't do that.
Right.
And they came back and said, okay, we're going to exempt the 10 states with the highest error rates. So the greatest irony of all is that to assuage Alaska, New York may have briefly gotten a reprieve and has this really, really, really perverse incentive to possibly have an even higher error rate.
Sure.
Just to not have those matching funds. No ideological consistency whatsoever.
When it comes to the work requirements, I read that states will have to recertify every 6 months, either the states or the individuals. And that's not necessarily an anti-fraud measure, right? They're sort of trying to hassle people off the rolls, I guess.
Exactly, and save money and using it as an excuse for their base. Oh, we're preventing waste, fraud, and abuse, people who don't want to work. Well, again, the largest number of SNAP recipients are working people, children, people with disabilities, veterans, and seniors. The so-called, under the current rules, able-bodied adults without dependents who are unemployed is about 7%. 7% of the caseload. And it's important to call these work reporting requirements. So they would force someone who's already working to leave their workplace, and low-income people generally work on the clock. And so they would lose their salaries for those few hours, sometimes to go wait on a line to report they are working. And just to play this out further, they raised the work requirements from 54 to 64. So let's say, just hypothetically, the Trump steel tariffs don't work. Just hypothetically. And you've had a job in a steel plant for a few decades, and you're 63. You lose your job. If you don't get a new job within 3 months, and God knows there's age discrimination in the workforce.
Sure.
After 3 months, you lose your benefits. And again, just the hypocrisy of it, as I've said before, there are no work requirements for trust fund kids who get mortgage interest deductions for daddy's or mommy's vacation home. There are no work requirements for agribusiness owners who own farmland, get millions of dollars continuously over decades for their farming operation. And the Nonpartisan General Accounting Office said that roughly a quarter of those who own farmlands and get these subsidies do no personal work on their farm whatsoever. So, I believe in a responsibility for all society. I'm not one of these progressive advocates who think, well, wealthy people sometimes shaft society, so let's just lower the standards for everyone. I'm a responsibility communitarianism, not a communist, communitarianism that supports people paying their fair share. And I'd be marginally less appalled by these unworkable work reporting requirements if they really applied to everyone. And if we really said to get government help, you need support. So another example of that, for instance, rather than giving everyone free debt relief for college, I'd support making national service, the AmeriCorps program, basically, that if you did a full year of that, you paid for your college. So I think it's important that, these policies are not moderate common sense ways to increase employment. They're not spending more money on job training. They're not spending more money on job subsidies. It's basically just to performatively, rant that they're sticking it to the non-workers.
So SNAP has long enjoyed bipartisan support because it's a subsidy to farmers and to supermarket owners and so forth. Are those industries going to get hurt in this program?
They will. In New York State alone, there are over 10,000 businesses and farmers markets that accept SNAP. I will say the traditional agriculture community and hunger community coalition If it's not dead, it's really on life support. And without getting too deep on the weeds in this, in the weeds, before there were so-called budget caps, and basically Congress could spend as much as they wanted on programs, there was enough money for the hunger programs in the USDA budget and the agriculture programs in the city budget, in the federal budget. And some of those agriculture projects, funding decades ago really did support more small farmers. And what's happened with the budget caps is it really has become the hunger programs versus the agriculture subsidy programs. And it's really moved more to these huge benefits for the largest corporations. I just did a webinar today with Jeff Christ, one of the best apple farmers in New York. He's got a family business started in 1883. And we all agree that healthier food is really important to health. I don't agree that the Trump administration is sincere about claiming that. But, the people, the medium-sized old family farmers who are producing fruits and vegetables got very little out of this bill.
What will the reductions mean for the families that are experiencing hunger? I mean, food insecurity, I know, coincides with a lot of really bad things or correlates with bad things.
We are raised to Frank Capra films, where there's always a happy ending. And there's the mean old banker, but everyone in town pools together their money and everything turns out well in the end. And the sad reality, and this is why The Daily Show once called me Mr. Frowny Pants, that's not how things work. Poor people suffer more. And poor people are going to suffer even more than this. Some people are saying the state of New York's a progressive state, they're going to pick up the difference. I'm not so sure. It took a decade for us to get $430 million a year for universal school meals. How we're going to come up with billions of dollars a year to pick up for these federal cuts is the state legislature and the governor going to cut other programs? I don't know. Are they going to pay, have tax cuts on the wealthy? I don't agree that if you have the wealthy pay their fair share, they're all going to move to Dubuque, or next door to Mar-a-Lago. But it's far from certain that the state governments will restore this money. And one of the ways to reduce the error rate, and over time, eventually, New York and other states are going to have to lower this administrative error rate, is just make it harder for people to get benefits. So this really is a lose population. I also just add that I'm a progressive who is worried about the deficit and worried about the debt. My old boss, Bill Clinton, understood that if you wanted to support progressive governments and robust government policies, you have to pay for them, including with tax increases in the rich. And he was trying to support corporate welfare cuts for things like mohair subsidies, which were started in World War II to subsidize uniforms for people. And he did, bring down the deficit. A debt and deficit over time that is exploding is, like everything else, going to hurt poor people more. When the economy gets sick, poor people get cancer. And so if this bill really reduced the debt, I'd still be against it, but say, okay, there's a broader government good. There's no government good here. It's going to explode the debt.
Sure. Now, Democrats in the House of Representatives have vowed to take control of the chamber next year. They said that during the debate. They were calling out individual members of Congress saying, you're going to lose your job, you're going to lose your job. If they do get control, whether it's this Congress, whether it works out the way they want, whether they're in control or not, with a big majority or not, what can the next Congress do to fix some of the downsides you're describing?
I think they should restore, all these cuts, but also they need a different kind of messaging. And I say this to my colleagues in the anti-hunger world, who sometimes imply that low-income people don't want to work. Most are working, and those who are unemployed or underemployed desperately want better-paying jobs. We actually started a job training program in Chicago and Baltimore to train people for jobs in social service work, not just blue-collar living, poverty work. And so I think the progressive message, and again, we're a nonpartisan organization, so I'll give advice to any side, but the policy should be about rewarding work, dealing with the wage cliff that says if you work a few more hours, you could lose more in benefits than you gain in wages, really supporting an upward mobility agenda of assets development, helping low-income people buy their own home, put a down payment for small business, save for retirement. And I think, one of the reasons progressives have had some political challenges is their agenda is sometimes seen as just too redistributive, and particularly immigrants really want aspirational policies, not like 10 years down the road, I want bigger, better SNAP. Of course, if you ask people, do you want more or less food benefits, they'll say more, but that's not on their dream wall. Their dream wall is to enter and stay in the middle class. So sure, if the Democrats get it back in power, they should restore these cuts, but they also need a bigger, bolder, aspirational, really economic empowerment agenda. And that will do both be very politically popular and do even more to reduce hunger and poverty.
So, Mr. Mamdani, the Democratic nominee, has promised to open 5 publicly owned supermarkets, one in each borough of the city, to help lower the cost of groceries, especially in so-called food deserts. I know it's not a new idea, but is it a good idea?
And let me first preface this, as I always do when I talk about campaigns, that Hunger Free America is a nonpartisan organization, doesn't take sides in campaigns. And personally, I'd like to believe I'm as progressive as they come. I think it's insane that we don't have a government-run single-payer healthcare system in America. That being said, working on food issues for a few decades now, I don't know that the best way to reduce hunger and make groceries more affordable is necessarily to have government-run grocery stores. Nonprofits have tried to run grocery stores. It's very difficult. Grocery stores often have very little profit margins, and they do by having very low wages. So I don't think Mr. Mamdani would want to have low wages for his workers. I think on the bigger picture, that the top issue facing New Yorkers is affordability. He is 1,000% right.
Sure.
And I wrote a column about this, 2 years ago, that in the presidential race, if people didn't realize affordability was the top issue, and if people said, oh, everything's great because the stock market's going up, they were going to lose. And I've never hated to be right more. And so he put his pulse on the single problem, greatest problem facing the city, the greatest cause of hunger in the city. Those who said he won just because he had great ads or a lot of volunteers or he's charismatic, all those help in campaigns. I used to work in campaigns. But to gloss over the centerpiece of his message, that the wealthier are getting wealthier at the expense of the working class and driving them out of the city is a huge mistake. He's 1,000% right on that, whether you support him or oppose him, for mayor and any candidate.
It's funny because I thought with the supermarkets, first of all, I've been doing the food shopping for my family since I was a kid. So I'm aware of how really, really hard and really, really complicated it is. You've got to get all these purveyors. You've got to make sure the workers show up on time. You've got to keep the store clean. There's a million different things that are going on. And, I love to watch, like all New Yorkers, the local bodega perform these miracles, whether they're Latino or Yemeni. These guys, they have to work 28 hours a day. They're scratching out a living. They're not getting rich, but they're making it happen. And I figure that doesn't sound like something government can do well, necessarily.
Yeah, and again, nonprofits that have troubles. I live in Park Slope. I'm very familiar with the Park Slope Food Co-op, which does make it work as a nonprofit, but they have people with extra time on their hands who volunteer, and so a lot of their labor is free.
Yes.
A food co-op in the Bronx started by someone very smart with an accomplished business degree failed because working people in the Bronx couldn't volunteer. So, look, Ross Barkan, the journalist turned politician, maybe turned journalist. Again, don't get any ideas, Errol.
No, been there.
Wrote a column in the New York Times, and he was, Mamdani was previously his campaign manager when he ran for state senate. So I have no idea whether the op-ed was a trial balloon on behalf of Mr. Mamdani or basically a message from a friend to Mr. Mamdani. And I read the language very precisely. He was talking about maybe the plan should be government helping for-profit grocery stores and other entities make the food affordable. So there's definitely a role for government. And we also got to look at food delivery. So many people are obsessed with brick and mortar stores, and one per borough isn't going to make much of a dent. You and I both live in Brooklyn. People living in public housing in Coney Island are not going to travel 45 minutes.
No, of course not. Of course not.
To go shopping.
No, it's clear to me. It's clearly just a demonstration. It's symbolic, but it's an important symbol saying, like, look, I'm putting this out here. That's how much I want to try and help you. Whether it actually works or not, whether or not we can bring it to scale or not, I am going to be fighting for you. So it's a perfect symbolic issue to put on your campaign website, which is what he's done. And other than that, it's pretty much harmless, right? Because as you've educated me, there are 3 million people who are experiencing food insecurity that get fed by New York or by SNAP benefits every day.
Statewide. In New York, it's a little over 1 million, but
yeah. So a million people in the city are getting help every day. You know, the 5 stores are not going to make that much difference. Now, let me ask you about this. I did not realize that there are 17 states, the one I know about is New Hampshire, where there's actually a state-owned monopoly on liquor sales, right? So I know liquor is not food, but for some people it is. But in the case of New Hampshire, there's a whole culture that has sprung up around the 80 state-owned liquor stores. And people go on liquor runs so they can come back to Boston with all of this cheap booze that they got in New Hampshire. So clearly some version of this could, in fact, lower prices for people.
I think some combination of government efforts and market forces are probably the right mix. And you're absolutely right. The issues you stand for are basically representatives of your values. And so, people think, oh, he said this, let's look at the decimal point. People want to know the values. Trump won, and I hate to tell my lefty friends who think the election was stolen, I knocked on enough doors. No, Trump won this time.
And he's still not going to build a wall, and that was never the point.
That's right. It's basically messaging, signaling to his supporters that I support these values. And there's so much that a progressive mayor can do on these issues. I think as critical I've been on Eric Adams just as a citizen, his food policy office run by my old friend and colleague Kate McKenzie's really doing a great job. And I think he's probably one of the few Adams people, or she was originally a de Blasio person, that the new mayor should keep. So there's some really smart, talented people in the city government. Not all of them have been, driven out. And I hope, the next mayor, whoever it is, can really rely on them while bringing in fresh blood and bringing in more progressive.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that. This is my last question for you is what does the next mayor and city council need to do about the perennial problem of hunger in New York City?
First and foremost, they need to make housing affordable. I'm not a housing advocate, but I'd first say, make housing affordable. You've dramatically reduced hunger. You need to raise wages and then make it easier to access the government safety net programs. I will die on this hill that New York City still has the lowest school breakfast participation out of any big city in the United States. Now that Governor Hochul has made free school meals universal and paid for by a combination of the state and federal government, it makes universal school breakfast even more important. Half the kids in New York City that don't get school lunch get school breakfast. So that should be really low-hanging fruit that the next mayor should be working on, and maximizing access to the federal nutrition program.
When you and I were, you held a forum that I was happy to moderate for mayoral candidates. You had an interesting proposal about building food into neighborhood planning. Say a little bit about that.
Absolutely. One thing that Scott Stringer proposed when he was city comptroller was something we'd been advocating for, to have neighborhood delivery hubs. For instance, a delivery center at public housing community centers. That's pretty popular in rural areas now, growing that Amazon might have some lockers. But we've got to move beyond just the focus on brick and mortar retail. And so having these delivery hubs where a company, instead of going up to 5 different apartments, braving 5 different elevators that may or may not work, having huge parking tickets, can just deliver to one place. And it's much better for the customers because they don't have to wait for the delivery to come. Sometimes like waiting for the cable person can be like waiting for Godot. For those who are not viewers of Irish drama, means Godot never came. Spoiler alert. that I think that's a proposal that would make sense. Yeah. And every time we're upzoning or downzoning, any of these changes, we ought to look at where food delivery spots are, where food retail spots are. Urban agriculture is never going to do anything but dent the problem, but we should certainly build that in, to urban planning, and it should be just just a central feature of everything we think about, just as much as density and sewer lines.
One of my other little obsessions is around the quality and quantity of food that people eat when they do get their hands on it, right? We have obesity, we have diabetes, we have all of the metabolic syndromes that come with eating an unhealthy diet. Is there a way to sort of dovetail that with your movement?
Absolutely. Hunger Free America previously had in New York City what we called a community-supported agriculture project, where people bought shares in regional farms, mostly low-income people. We heavily subsidized it with grant money. We also accepted SNAP benefits, and we had waiting lists in some of the lowest income neighborhoods in New York. If you build it, they will come. If you make healthier food more affordable and physically available and convenient for low-income working people, they will eat it. There is a myth, and frankly, that myth has some unfortunate racial biases underneath it, some unfortunate racial gender biases beneath it, some unfortunate class biases believe it, that low-income people don't eat healthily because they're too lazy or ignorant. That's just not true. Build it, they will come. Make healthier food more affordable and available. We can both reduce hunger and reduce obesity and increase life expectancy.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've got to make it. I mean, look, I went through an entire diet change a little over a year ago because I had some negative health information. And my cardiologist said, look, go on this diet, right? Basically, the Eric Adams, the Cleveland Clinic heart healthy diet, which is essentially vegan, right, with no oil. And when you see the numbers move, when you see within 6 odd weeks that you've dropped a bunch of weight, that all of your critical numbers are moving in the right direction, it really was a great incentive. And then along the way, you're like, hey, you know what? I like fresh strawberries. I like fresh blueberries. I like fresh produce. And its ingredients, it's actually pretty cheap down at the bottom of the food chain.
Yeah, a whole other thing government's got to do is work with medical schools to have more nutrition education for doctors.
Yes.
10 years ago, when I wrote my first book, a little more than 10 years ago, I looked at Harvard Medical School. They had a few hundred electives, like 3 on nutrition, dozens on heart disease. I once went to a cardiologist that said I had high cholesterol, and I asked, could I change that with diet and exercise?
Yeah.
And this well-trained cardiologist said no. So even in the medical profession, there's
crazy.
a lot of ignorance, and the money is in pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
And so we need to change that, and the city and the federal government can do that. And if Robert F. Kennedy was serious about making America healthy, he would do something serious about that.
Yeah. Well, I'll just. My 2 cents went from cholesterol 211 to, I just got my numbers earlier this week, 133. Took a little over a year.
Our grandparents told us you are what you eat, but it's true.
Very true. Well, thanks very much for coming by. We're going to continue to cover this, and I hope that we'll have some better news to talk about next time you come through.
Hope so, too.
Okay. If you want to keep up with what's happening in New York politics and hear more conversations with the people shaping the future of New York and beyond, subscribe to our channel. And let Spectrum News be your resource for balanced, in-depth political coverage, elections, and issues that matter to you.